Greetings, I'm Shad, and Matpat over from the Game Theorists channel has recently made a video on who would win, knights, samurais, or Vikings, based off the video game For Honor. Now, as you can imagine, I have a lot to say about this because this is kind of my forte, my specialty, medieval arms and weapons and all that stuff. Now, I want to say that generally I like Matt's content, okay? This isn't meant to make a disparagement against him as an individual, but it is very, not only clear, it's obvious, it's factual, that he has gotten some facts very wrong, and so it behooves me to clear up some of the gross misconceptions that exist in his video. Not to say everything he says is wrong, and I have been just as capable as anyone for getting things wrong as well. One of the differences that I actively go out of my way to do is that when I am proven wrong, I happily admit it and also make a video telling you guys the facts that I've gotten wrong so you are more accurately informed. So I do not think any less of him as a person for getting some of these facts wrong. I've done it, you do it, it happens. And this also does not mean that he doesn't make great content. He does. Okay, Matt's assumption that the Vikings wore no armor at all.
Vikings, as if going for maximum machismo, wore practically nothing for protection from either people or the threat of icicles to the crotch.
Now, there are some cases that I know of, and it wasn't actually attributed to the Vikings, so, there could be something that I'm unaware of what the Vikings did, of certain warriors, so the old Gauls and such, going into battle naked. But in regards to Vikings not wearing armor at all, that is only partially correct. I've never heard of any accounts of Vikings going into battle full-blown naked. Many did just wear woolen tunics, but wealthier Vikings did have mail. So the idea that they didn't because they were afraid that the sea salt would rust it to death is, no, wrong. And even though there's no archaeological evidence for padded armors like Gambeson, well, we wouldn't expect to find any archaeological evidence for these armors because they're organic material. They simply rot away and break down over a certain length of time. So even though that's the case, there are good chances that the Vikings had some type of padded armament for the less wealthy Vikings. Now, the misconceptions about Gambeson armor and what people that play video games, role-playing games, I'm one of them, okay? I used to have this misconception as well. They would think of this as padded armor and then attribute its effectiveness to the effectiveness that video games and Dungeons and Dragons proclaim it to be, one of the lowest levels of armor, which is absolute bull, okay? Tests have been done on Gambeson to show that depending on the layers of linen that are in these quilted garments, and if you wanted a Gambeson that was properly defended, real thing, armor, it would have a lot of layers. And doing tests against these things, they can stop arrows, okay, from longbows. So not only is it likely that Vikings wore Gambeson-like armor in the early medieval period, Gambesons were used in the high medieval period as well, and even a bit later. Gambesons were just amazing, and they have been used by so many different cultures, not just Vikings, through so many different periods in history. Why? Because it was so effective! I have a whole video discussing the truth about Gambesons and leather armor as well. Link in the description if you want to go watch that. Now, even addressing the fact that Vikings did wear armor on occasion, I'm not going to disagree with Matt in regards that he feels Vikings would not win against knights or samurais of this period. It's a much closer battle, okay, trying to assess all the things that I've studied about history and stuff like that than what Matt is implying, but the real clincher that makes Vikings fall off in this regards is not their lack of armor, but the fact that they did not use horses, okay? Knights and samurais are classically mounted warriors, which gives them a massive and profound advantage. So that is the reasons why the Vikings would lose in this scenario. Okay, Matpat says that huge castles became the norm, and because I can only assume he's referring to the 11th century here, I have to call him out on this. No. Castles did exist, but they were not huge. In fact, the type of castles that were around in the 11th century were the Motte and Bailey style castles, which were more predominantly wooden structures. Now, having said this, during this time there were a small number of stone keeps, okay? Not full-on stone walls where everything was stone, okay? They would generally have a wooden palisade around the middle, and on top of the primary earthworks, there would be what is called a Norman keep, which is a square stone structure. And again, these keeps nowhere near as big as people think. On the inside, there's only enough room for literally one room on each level, and I'm referring to this period. Later on, square-style keeps did get bigger and accommodate for more rooms, but in this period, the square stone keeps only big enough for one room on each level. And I have many videos dedicated to the finer points of castle design, structure, and defenses here on my YouTube channel.
And with castles came knights.
No, it was with local fragmented governments of the early medieval period that came knights. You see, with the land divided and ruled over by lesser local lords in a feudal system, it was requisite upon these local rulers to train soldiers that would serve them because they couldn't rely on the state for military defense. Now, these soldiers that these local lords needed were actually pretty well equipped because, no, these lords didn't have enough money to, raise an army of 200, but they could equip maybe 15 to 20 men really, really well to the best technology that was available of the time. But they weren't going to give just the average Joe this really good equipment. No, they were going to make sure these men would be totally loyal to them. In fact, they made them swear loyalty, and these men would become their bondsmen or bondservants. And funny, the name for bondsmen or bondservants is connect, which later came to be spoken as knight. There's another addition to this concept of how the knight actually truly came to be, which was not because of castles, and it comes back to the fact that these local lords wanted to equip these soldiers with the best gear that was available, and one of the most effective styles of combat that had been proven in previous parts of history, the Romans did this, and even some cultures in the classical period, was impact warfare, or in other words, shock cavalry. And, would you know it, I have a whole video talking about the origin of shock cavalry. So, these local lords wanted to give these men horses. That cost money, but they had money to do that, and this is why knights originally needed to swear fealty to a higher lord, because these individual soldiers, or indeed even mercenaries, they didn't have the money to be able to train and then maintain a horse, let alone the other expensive arms and armor. Now, of course, it was very important that these bondsmen, these connects, knights, needed to be good at riding a horse. So therefore the craft of mounted combat was very, very important. Now the word that means a warrior on horseback in French is called a chevalier, and the word that means the craft of mounted combat was called chevalerie. Just like the word that means a man who builds things with wood is carpenter, and the word that means the craft of making things out of wood is carpentry. Now this word, chivalry, later came to be spoken as chivalry. And this word was even adopted by the English, because remember, most of the English nobility spoke French. So chivalry also became an English word that meant the craft of mounted combat. And it was very important that knights were good at chivalry or chivalry because that was their main style of combat. Now, of course, in later periods in history, the horse became less significant for the knight, but other types of combat and indeed social behavior, just pure expectations on what it was that made a knight good, evolved to be very important to what a knight needed to do to be good at his craft. Well, those things also came to be spoken as chivalry or chivalry. So when someone said a knight needs to be chivalrous, it was them saying a knight needs to be good at doing the things that make a knight good. It started off as being good on horse, and then that evolved into so many other things, and I made a whole video on what those other things were and how they could be interpreted in my video, The Truth About Chivalry and the Knight. You see, I've made a lot of videos about this stuff, okay? I've done my research, not to say that I get everything right, but as I mentioned, when I find I got something wrong, I correct myself and I tell you guys about it. Okay, Matpat then says that knights were all about swords and spears. That part is correct, but when he goes on to say more specifically and more accurately long swords and polearms, Well, no, not necessarily, especially not for the 11th century. Now, if you class spears as polearms, then yes, spears were absolutely used by knights on horseback. But longswords? In the 11th century? Longswords did not even exist in the 11th century. And maybe because Matpat is getting confused by the definition that is often spoken of in Dungeons & Dragons and other things like that as to what a longsword is. In Dungeons & Dragons 3 and 3.5 and Advanced and every edition before then, and it might even be in 4th edition, I'm not sure about 5th edition, but they call a one-handed medieval sword a longsword, which is absolutely incorrect. A longsword is the classic two-handed medieval sword. And many people would probably identify them as greatswords, but no, greatswords were their own beast entirely as well. But for people using role-playing game type of definitions, a one-handed sword is an arming sword, a two-handed sword is a longsword, and a massive monstrous two-handed sword is a greatsword. Longswords became commonplace in around the late 13th century, and then into the 14th century and onwards. There are a couple of cases of swords with a bit longer handles before this period, but they are not representative or common, okay? When you say the weapons that knights used in the 11th century, it was not the longsword. And in regards to polearms, they were not the complex or elaborate polearms that you see in later periods. Now, I will mention, Matpat does say that a lot of the weaponry shown in For Honor is not accurate to the 11th century. But it really does seem like he is believing that knights had longswords, big two-handed swords in the 11th century, which is, no, absolutely incorrect. The next thing that Matpat says is that knights, their main armour was mail, chainmail, which is true enough, but then he says they only had mail hauberks. No, knights could actually be clad head to toe, alright, their legs covered included, and hands in mail. And the other thing that he doesn't mention is that in a lot of cases, knights would also wear Gambeson underneath. Now remember how I was saying that Gambeson is phenomenally good, far better than people think? Well, combine that effectiveness with mail, and when you do that, you have a profoundly effective armament. One that would resist many types of arrow fire. In fact, to get through this type of armor, you need a very powerful bow. We're talking war bow levels. And I don't think the samurai bows were at that level. I could be wrong, okay, because I'm not an expert on the Japanese stuff, but I will share the things that I do know. Now, is the samurai body armor superior to the armor of the knights in this period? Or, gee, this is a very hard one to make a call on for myself, looking at it, trying to be objective as I can. And in fact, regarding this and the finer points of the samurai equipment and stuff like that, I would probably handball this to the Metatron. The Metatron is a fabulous YouTuber, a good friend of mine, and he is far more versed in Japanese arms and armor. So if anyone has any questions in regards to the Japanese side of things, I refer you to him. The link to his YouTube channel is in the description below. And so because of this, it's too difficult for me to make a call, because if this is plate equivalent style armor that the Japanese have in this period, well, that might have given the samurai an advantage, if not for a very significant point that Matpat has neglected. And this is my biggest gripe with Matpat's analysis. He leaves out one of the most important defensive features that the knights of this period had. Like, seriously, I can't believe he missed this. This is this is really important for what the knights were like. And in fact, it's the thing that gives knights huge protection, even more so than their regular armor, against arrow fire and really anything. And that is shields. The knights of the 11th century used shields. And I'm not talking about, the prissy little heater shields. I'm talking about big, beastie kite shields. And, would you know it, I've made 2 whole videos on the kite shield. Kite shields could easily be the height of a full man, okay, and give full cover for the knight. They were not as heavy as people suppose. It would give protection while the knight was on horseback, and so the knight is far more defended than Matpat is saying in his analysis. In fact, these shields would not only protect the knights against arrow fire to let them close the distance, it would give them a massive advantage in melee combat as well, because samurais, as I understand it, okay, I fully admit my knowledge on samurais is less extensive than my knowledge knowledge of medieval knights' weapons and armour. But as I understand it, Matpat is right that samurais were very much mounted warriors of this time that preferred the bow. The bow and yumi, or spear, specifically. Now, as Metatron has pointed out in a wonderful video, shields did exist in Japan, but by the time of the samurai they fell out of practice, meaning we can say with a fair level of accuracy that the samurai of the 11th century rarely ever used shields. And therefore, if you were to take the standard samurai, he wouldn't have a shield because it was such a rare exception. And also, just to point out, the shields that the Japanese did use, that, the Metatron points out in his video, are much smaller, okay? The knights had massive kite shields, and like I mentioned in my kite shields video, I believe the kite shield to be the king of the shields, the best shield that was ever designed out of all shields that exist in history. Yes, that's a bit of subjective opinion, but I base that on my analysis of how effective they are. They are just amazing. So if we were to say that the samurais had the types of shields that did exist in Japan, well, their types of shields are far less effective in design and size than the kite shield. Now, as bad as overlooking the fact that the knights have shields was, this next statement, it's even worse.
The strength and increased mobility of the samurai's armor and the addition of melee weapons would eventually overwhelm the slower, more tank-like knights.
So really, I should say this statement is my biggest gripe with the video, even though it's just a short, brief comment. Oh my goodness, there are so many misconceptions with this statement, it's painful. The samurai were not faster than the knights, okay? In every test that has ever been done by people wearing these armors, and you could include mail armor to the full-plate harnesses that knights later wore in the 15th century, their speeds are absolutely equivalent. Samurai armor is actually heavier than many people think, and medieval armor is much lighter than many people suppose. One of the things that people totally miss about medieval armor when they're trying to weigh up everything is the fact that it's dispersed over the whole body. And because this is dispersed over the whole body, it doesn't feel like there's a massive weight on your shoulder. In fact, it's very even. And this is the thing. Full-plate armor is objectively superior to the best types of samurai armor. So in this sense, yes, the knights are more tanky, but they are not slower. And this is the other thing, there are so many examples of medieval style armor that's actually equivalent in weight and lighter than standard samurai armor, because there were so many variations and different combinations of what could comprise medieval armor. Knights were not slower than samurai. Now, some of you who are willing to accept this might still think that samurai are faster because the katana is a faster weapon. Oh my goodness, that concept is as misguided as the armor one. For its size, the katana actually errs on the heavier side of standard sword weights. That's not to say it's a heavy sword or is unreasonably heavy for its size. It's just that there are many swords of same size that are much lighter than the katana. And if you try and compare it directly to the longsword, the weights are equivalent, but the longsword has greater reach, which actually means the speed of a longsword's tip when in rotation will always be moving faster than a katana. Also, in general, the point of balance of a longsword is closer to the hilt than that of a katana. This makes redirecting the blade of the sword easier, and therefore accelerating the blade and stopping it faster. Now, what I've just said runs so contrary to what pop culture likes to promote, and I have devoted so many videos onto this concept. I have 5 videos going into massive depth about the katana, and more recently I have posted a video comparing the katana and longsword completely. So if you're gonna try and argue me on this point, please go watch my videos before you say I'm wrong. So this changes up the comparison of who would win in the 11th century specifically, knights or samurais. In fact, it makes it a very, very hard comparison. I'm not sure I could make a call on who would win over the other. But if I had to, if I really had to, I've got to give the edge to the knights. And the big, most important tipping factor are shields. For me, in any case. Now, if you would like to hear my thoughts on who would win between knights and samurais in their peaks, okay, talking about 15th century knights and samurais when they had better armor, better weapons, well, I've made a whole video on that as well. My video, Knights vs. Samurais. And so there you go, these are the corrections that I wanted to make to the Game Theorists or Matpat's video. Who would win, Samurai, Knight, or Viking? This was not made as a disparagement against Matpat. I think he's a great guy. He makes wonderful, excellent, very entertaining content. And like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've gotten many things wrong in the past as well, so I do not hold this against him. And please, anyone who watches this video, don't hold it against him either. In fact, if you're not aware of the Game Theorist channel, I really recommend you go check out his videos. They're wonderful. Thank you very much for watching. I hope to see you next time, and until then, farewell.